It started as an ordinary day, a humid September morning in Marseille, the kind that clings to your shirt and makes the streets feel like they're holding their breath. But behind the stone walls of Baumettes prison, history was drawing its final breath too. I remember the first time I stumbled across the date, 10th of September 1977. At first it didn't register, but then I read the line again, the last time France used the guillotine. 1977. The same year punk rock exploded onto the airwaves when Star Wars hit the cinemas and lit up imaginations everywhere. Elvis had just died. The Concorde was flying. It was an age of modernity, of rebellion, of change. And yet, while Parisians were queuing for Anarchy in the UK and French kids were clutching Star Wars tickets, the state was still using an 18th century beheading machine to execute its criminals, not in some distant province or forgotten back room, but in Marseille, in one of France's great cities, under the morning sun. The man who died that day was Hamida Djandoubi, Tunisian immigrant, war veteran, convicted murderer. He would be the last person in Western Europe to die by guillotine. But his story is more than a macabre factoid. It's a window into the tension of a nation standing on the edge of the modern world and refusing even for a moment to let go of the past. So I went digging through court transcripts, yellowing newspaper columns, government memos. I wanted to know why the blade still fell that day, and what it meant for France, for all of us, that it took that long to stop. This is the story of that last guillotine execution, a story caught between history and headlines, between justice, cruelty, and spectacle. Let's begin. If you'd told someone in the 1790s that the guillotine would still be in use nearly 2 centuries later, they'd probably laugh or shudder. Originally hailed as the humane option, the guillotine was meant to symbolize equality before the law. Nobles and peasants alike, all met the same fate under its blade. It was the product of Enlightenment thinking and revolutionary justice, swift, mechanical, and free of the gruesome flailing that came with hanging or the axe. But by the 20th century it had become something else entirely, a relic, a chilling curiosity. It was no longer used in public squares under rapturous crowds. After the 1939 execution of Eugen Weidmann turned into a grotesque Parisian spectacle, with people climbing lampposts for a better view, the French government moved executions behind closed doors. From then on, the guillotine operated in the shadows, out of sight, out of mind. Yet it never went away. Right through the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s, the blade kept falling, quietly, deliberately, always before dawn. The state would inform only a select few, the lawyer, the judge, the priest, the prison doctor. Sometimes even the families didn't find out until the newspapers ran the headline. And this is the part that fascinates me and troubles me. While the rest of Europe had turned away from capital punishment, France held on. In fact, by the 1970s, it was the last country in Western Europe still executing people. Even as disco balls spun and space operas played, France kept a steel blade ready behind prison walls. It was as if the country couldn't quite bring itself to break with the past. Some called it tradition. Others called it barbarism, wearing a bureaucrat's suit. But by 1977, that tension was building to a head. And the man who would test it, perhaps unintentionally, was a young immigrant from Tunisia named Hamida Djandoubi. Hamida Jandooi wasn't born into violence. Like many others, he came to France looking for a better life. Born in Tunisia in 1949, he arrived in Marseille in the late 1960s, one of thousands of young North African men drawn by the promise of work, housing, a fresh start. But reality rarely matched the posters. He settled in the city's tough northern districts, tower blocks, concrete estates, and a sense of being tolerated more than welcomed. He worked as a labourer. Basic jobs. Long hours. Then, in 1971, his life changed dramatically. A workplace accident cost him part of his right leg. Some reports say it was a construction site mishap, others a traffic incident. But the result was the same. He was fitted with a prosthetic and signed off as disabled, and with that came the slow erosion of hope. He fell into odd jobs and petty scams, drifted through bars, picked up by the police a few times for theft and minor assaults. He wasn't a criminal mastermind, but he was angry and deeply insecure. Those close to him described him as volatile, sometimes violent, especially after a few drinks. It was around this time that he met Elisabeth Bousquet, a young woman who had worked as a cleaner and had briefly been involved in sex work. Their relationship was intense, complicated, and deeply toxic. Some accounts suggest that Djandoubi tried to manipulate or coerce Bousquet into recruiting other women into prostitution. She refused. She reported him to the police in 1973. That single act of defiance may have sealed her fate. After serving time for the coercion charges, Djandoubi came out bitter and fixated. He began stalking Bousquet, threatening her, and, on the 3rd of July 1974, abducted her. What happened next was brutal. Her body was found days later, strangled, tortured, and partially burned in the outskirts of Marseille. It was a crime that shocked the city, not just because of its cruelty, but because it was personal. Djandoubi was arrested shortly after. Witnesses had seen him with Bousquet that night. He confessed during interrogation, though he later claimed the confession was coerced. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. The city that once offered him a future now prepared to pass sentence. But it wouldn't just be on him. It would be on the very idea of justice by guillotine. Marseille, February 1977. The Palais de Justice stood like a monument to the old order, towering columns, echoing halls, and the quiet tension of a courtroom about to decide a man's life. Hamida Djandoubi appeared before the assize court of the Bouches du Dard. He wore a dark suit, calm, controlled. Some say he looked defiant, others said he seemed resigned. Either way, he was facing charges of murder, torture, and kidnapping. The prosecution wasn't pulling punches. They painted a picture of a vengeful man with a dangerous streak, someone who had sought revenge against a woman who challenged his control. The defense tried to steer the narrative differently. They argued that Djandoubi was not in full control of his faculties, that the amputation, the painkillers, the alcohol, and the trauma had fractured his mental state. They didn't deny the crime, but they pushed for leniency, suggesting he was not fully responsible. It was a risky move. The French justice system at the time didn't offer many shades of grey when it came to violent murder, especially one that involved torture, especially when the public was watching, especially when newspapers were already framing it as a test case for capital punishment. For 4 days, testimony was heard. Witnesses described Djandoubi's obsession with Bousquet. The police detailed the discovery of her body, the burns, the ligature marks. A court psychiatrist testified that Djandoubi was not insane. Disturbed, yes, but aware of his actions. On 25th February 1977, the jury took just a few hours to return their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by guillotine. The presiding judge reportedly paused before reading the sentence, knowing what it meant, not just for Djandoubi, but for a country increasingly uneasy with the death penalty. But still the words rang out, la peine de mort, death There was no applause, no shouts, just the scraping of chairs as the courtroom emptied. Outside, the headlines were already being written. One read, "The blade will fall again." But in homes across France, the question lingered, should it? After the trial, the wheels turned quickly. Too quickly, some said. There was no drawn-out appeals process, no years spent behind bars waiting for a ruling. In 1977 France, once a death sentence was confirmed, the timetable was tight. Hamida Djandoubi was moved back to Baumettes prison, placed under 24-hour surveillance in the death cell. A priest was offered, so was a lawyer. A final appeal was filed and denied. President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had the power to grant clemency. But he didn't. Despite growing unease about capital punishment, Giscard saw himself as a man of principle. He'd sign off on the execution. The executioner, Marcel Chevalier, received the order and began preparations. He was the last of his kind, a state executioner trained in a role passed down like a craft, quietly inherited, never spoken about publicly. Chevalier had only taken over from André Aubrecht a few years earlier. This would be one of his first major duties, no fanfare, no audience, just precision. And so, in the early hours of the 10th of September 1977, the stage was set. At 4:40 a.m., Djandoubi was roused from his cell. Reports say he was calm. He refused the priest, shook hands with his lawyer, and walked under guard through a quiet courtyard to a small concrete enclosure. There, hidden from the public eye, stood the guillotine, a steel and wood structure, covered by canvas for discretion. The blade gleamed in the floodlights. No last words from Djandoubi have ever been confirmed. At 4:45 a.m., the blade fell. It was over in seconds. The state issued a brief press release later that morning. Hamida Jandooi was executed by guillotine this morning at Marseille's Baumettes prison. The sentence was carried out in accordance with the law, no photos, no footage, no public debate. At least not yet. But outside, France was already changing. Here's the thing that makes this story hit different. 1977 didn't feel like the kind of year a guillotine should still be working. That summer, French teenagers were listening to the Sex Pistols blasting out Anarchy in the UK on vinyl turntables. Across the channel, punk had taken root, torn shirts, spiked hair, and safety pins in cheeks. In the US, a little sci-fi film called Star Wars had just landed, and within weeks French cinemas were packed. Spaceships, laser swords, droids. The future had arrived, fast and loud. But in the early hours of 10th September, while kids queued for popcorn and punk gigs, the French Republic silently wheeled out an 18th century beheading machine. It felt off, like a jarring cut in a film. The most modern country in Europe was clinging to its most ancient punishment, and for many it came as a surprise. There was no national referendum on the death penalty, no widespread media coverage ahead of time. Djandoubi's case was not well known beyond Marseille. Most people only found out about the execution after the fact, from brief newspaper mentions or radio bulletins, and when they did, the reaction was mixed. Some shrugged, others applauded, but many were stunned. How, they asked, was France still doing this? This wasn't the Middle Ages. This was the year Elvis Presley died, the year Apple launched its second computer, the year Bowie and Iggy Pop were recording in Berlin. It was the start of something new, fast-paced, rebellious, global. And yet, in the quiet corners of government, the guillotine remained, untouched by time, unquestioned by policy. That moment and the fall of the blade in 1977 exposed a fracture in the national identity. France was modern on the outside, but still carrying ghosts beneath the surface. But change was coming. It just needed the right voice. In the years that followed Djandoubi's execution, the death penalty wasn't just debated, it became a symbol, a line in the sand between old-world justice and modern values. At the heart of the abolition movement stood a man named Robert Badinter, lawyer, thinker, humanist, and soon-to-be Minister of Justice under President François Mitterrand. Badinter had long campaigned against the death penalty. He'd defended men facing the blade. He'd seen up close how fallible the justice system could be. For him, Hamida Djandoubi's execution wasn't justice served. It was a failure. Not because Djandoubi was innocent, but because Badinter believed that no state should hold the right to take a life, no matter how severe the crime. And in 1981, the political tides shifted. Mitterrand won the presidency on a progressive platform. Within months, Badinter introduced legislation to abolish the death penalty in France. It wasn't easy. The public was still divided. Some polls showed a majority in favour of keeping capital punishment, but Badinter pressed on. His speeches in the National Assembly were powerful, not angry, not moralising, but deeply human. He reminded lawmakers that justice must be irreversible, but punishment need not be fatal. He pointed to other Western nations that had moved on, and he invoked the ghost of Timothy Evans in the UK and the shadow of Djandoubi in France. Cases where emotion ran high and facts were sometimes lost. On the 18th of September 1981, the bill passed. Just 4 years after Djandoubi lost his life, the guillotine lost its place in French law. It was the end of a dark chapter. The machine that had ended the lives of over 16,000 people since the revolution, including kings, queens and criminals, was retired, silently, finally. But the memory of its last victim remained. It's hard to imagine that Hamida Djandoubi, a man with a broken past and a brutal crime, would become a historical footnote, but he did. Not because of who he was, but because of how he died. Ask someone in France today about the case, and they might not recall the name. But say, the last man guillotined, and eyes widen. The irony is cruel. His death, more than his life, left a mark. A man guilty of a horrific act became an accidental symbol of a system that had overstayed its welcome, of a punishment that no longer fit the era. What makes it even stranger is how close it all feels. 1977 isn't ancient history. There are people alive today who were teenagers when Djandoubi was executed. Journalists who remember covering the announcement. Activists who protested outside courthouses in the years that followed. And while France officially closed the book on capital punishment, the conversation hasn't disappeared. Every so often, after a particularly shocking crime or a rise in violent headlines, the debate bubbles up again. Could it ever return? Should it? Most agree the answer is no. But Djandoubi's execution is still held up as the moment France finally drew the line. There's one more piece of irony to chew on too. The man who executed Djandoubi, Marcel Chevalier, would live until 2008. Long after the blade had been dismantled, he occasionally spoke to the press. Quiet, unassuming. When asked how he felt about his role in history, he once said, "I just did my job. It wasn't my place to question the law, and maybe that's what this whole story comes down to. Laws, and who enforces them, who questions them, who suffers under them, and who gets to change them. Because when you pull back the curtain, this wasn't just about one man and one death. It was about a nation learning to let go of something old, something bloody, something that no longer belonged in the mirror of modern France. It started as an ordinary day, a quiet September morning, a routine execution carried out behind prison walls, no headlines, no drama, just a man and a machine. But that day, 10th September 1977, marked the end of something extraordinary. It was the last time a Western democracy used the guillotine, the last time the French Republic chose the blade over the future. And it happened while disco filled the airwaves, while punk exploded through alleyways, while kids queued for Star Wars. In the same year the world was dreaming of galaxies far, far away. France was still answering to the ghosts of Robespierre. That contradiction is what lingers. Hamida Djandoubi wasn't a martyr. He wasn't innocent. His crime was brutal, and justice was needed. But the method, the silence, the cold efficiency, that's what made the world take notice. It forced France to ask, who are we now? And more importantly, who do we want to be? As I pieced together this story, from archives, from interviews, from yellowing trial transcripts, I couldn't help but wonder how many other moments in history felt so ordinary at the time, only to echo louder as the years wore on. So now I turn to you. Do you believe the death penalty ever has a place in a modern society? And if justice must be done, what does it mean for it to be humane? Let me know what you think in the comments. Whether you remember 1977 or just marvel at how close it still feels, this story belongs to all of us. Because sometimes history doesn't feel like the past at all.